Thanks for choosing this free Anfield Index podcast. If you'd prefer to listen to this or any of our other shows without adverts, then now's the time to check out Anfield Index Pro. With AI Pro, you can supercharge your entire listening experience. You'll not only get all of our podcasts without the ads, but you'll have them far faster with our Quick Publish feature available exclusively for subscribers. AI Pro also puts you in the heart of our sound studio, with an option to listen to many of our shows live and interact with the podcasters in real time as the shows are recording. Upgrading couldn't be easier. AI Pro is available on all popular podcast platforms, and we have our own apps for Apple and Android. Just head on over to AnfieldIndexPro.com and get started today.
Podcasting to you from a field here in beautiful rural Ireland, I'm Trev Downey, and this is Money Talks with Mo Chatra. So let's welcome the man himself to his own show. Good evening, Mo.
Good evening, Trev. How are you?
I'm good, man. I'm looking forward to this one because it's a topic I have a lot of interest in. And just to tee it up for our listeners, what we're going to be talking about tonight is the thorny subject of investment and ownership. And rarely are two topics liable to come together and cause quite so much consternation as these two do. I want to give you an opportunity to tee it up yourself before we get stuck straight into it, because obviously this is coming off the back, as so many of the shows are, of a thread which got quite a lot of engagement, as they tend to do. And, you know, what I love about your particular area of expertise is that it brings all these utter incompetent non-experts out offering pretty what they believe are profound opinions, which can be easily batted away. So I want to offer you a chance to set it up, the topic in general. If there's anything that by way of summary, in case there's anything I've left out there, and we'll get straight into the general structure of your thread with a series of questions that I'll pose to you then.
Sounds good. Excellent.
Right. Well, then we'll do it. We'll just get on and do it. So this thread that we've spoken about, it was basically about the situation that Liverpool finds themselves in. I think it's a recent enough thread, and it got, like I say, always does get a lot of interaction, a lot of traction in terms of eyes on it and interactions with it. Let's look at this thorny subject of what people perceive as, for right or wrong, underinvestment. Now, your argument for why that is occurring, and if that is occurring, is that it's basically down to two root causes, that there are two basic causes for Liverpool's poor start to this season. Why are you feeling that there are only two? What is it that you're getting to with that assertion?
Okay, yeah. So the thread that I put out, Trev, I think it was last week or maybe the week before, was just reflecting on the poor start that we've obviously had to the season 2022-23. Clearly far too few victories. We're accustomed to winning vast majority of our games. We've been almost spoiled in recent years. We've come to expect wins. Draws feel like losses, and losses feel like something worse than that. And, you know, I looked at all the various factors and thought about, well, are some of them valid? And, you know, obviously many fans all across social media have come out with all sorts of reasons as to why, some of which are completely from another planet. But the more serious and credible ones, I felt did come down to two root causes, and I felt that those two root causes were, as you've noted, underinvestment and loyalty. So with underinvestment, then I did a bit of analysis a few weeks ago towards the tail end of the summer transfer window. So this was in late August, looking at the club's spend on transfer fees post 2018. Now, the reason I specifically looked at spend post 2018 is that I felt, and I think a lot of fans felt, that, you know, we had an absolute purple patch of recruitment between 2016 and 2018. If you remember back to the summer of 2016, we'd finished the season up to that point, runners up in the Europa, and finished, I think it was 8th in the league, and we're feeling frustrated in one sense, but then optimistic in the other sense, in that Jurgen Klopp was going into his first full season as Liverpool manager, and we welcomed Sadio Mane in, and we're all delighted to see him come in, and very excited about what he could develop into under the expert coaching of Klopp and co. And we saw after that, some absolutely fantastic recruitment. We saw Ginny and others come in, culminating in 2018 with our biggest summer transfer window today with, who was it? Alisson, Naby Keita then joined us, Fabinho came through, and Big Shaq as well. And, that supplemented the arrival of Virgil van Dijk a few months prior in January of 2018. So we had a really, really good 2 years. And after that, it all went very quiet. Now, clearly, by that point, we had a very strong squad. There was clearly not the need to be bringing in 5 or 6 players every summer. And it would have been ridiculous and absurd to, A, expect that, but B, for that to be in any way realistic. It simply wasn't. We had a very good core of, say, 18 or so, maybe 19 players, and could they have been supplemented by stronger squad additions? Yes, they could have. And it was summer 2019. We were frustrated at missing out on the Premier League by a point, but delighted to have won number 6 in Europe. And John W. Henry, at the start of that summer transfer window, noted that the club would be backing, and FSG would be backing Jurgen in terms of recruitment. And on that basis, based off of his comments, we all thought, great, we're going to see even more strong arrivals to turn this into an even stronger squad. And then our marquee signing turned out to be Sepp Vandenberg, a player nobody had heard of, and he was signed for 2-3 million pounds. We also saw a couple of frees come in, Andy Lonergan and Adrian, as well as young Harvey Elliott, who I think was only 16 at the time, and his transfer fee wasn't agreed until about a year, 18 months later. So, very disappointing. And we thought, right, okay, we clearly have missed out there. But surely next summer we'll do some more business. The following summer came along, and the world had changed with the onset of COVID-19, and the financial landscape changed with it, where football and everything else, needless to say, was concerned. We still did do some business, though. We brought in Thiago, we brought in Diogo Jota, and we brought in Costa Tsimikas. But again, there was frustration. We thought, okay, we have lost Dejan Lovren, and we are now going into this new season as Premier League champions with only 3 senior centre-backs. Surely a big risk, and that's an understatement, because we just had a complete nightmare season with injuries, and the season ended up being a bit of a write-off, but we salvaged it right at the end by scraping top 4. Summer 21, summer 22, once again, meagre spend relative to our rivals. So it was 4 years, 4 summers, I should say, on the trot, where we didn't really invest to the levels of our rivals. And, that was the analysis that I carried out. And it showed that purely in terms of transfer fee net spend, as a proportion of overall turnover, the percentage was only 2%. So only 2% of our overall turnover over that period went towards net spend on transfer fees. And yet some of our rivals, granted 1 or 2 of them had money coming in from sources other than club-generated revenues, they were able to spend significantly more. And I was then concerned that, closing out that summer 22 window a few weeks ago, to have gone 4 successive summers where I felt we'd not really invested enough. The concern was the squad had aged out, that we'd sure kept a stable squad, little turnover in terms of the core squad, but at some point that would create a problem. And I didn't anticipate it would create a problem to the extent it has in the opening weeks of this season.
Yeah, and that last point quite eloquently puts together the two ideas. I downplayed the notion of loyalty to players as one of your points of discussion tonight, but that last point that you made sort of encapsulates both. And you spoke about rivals, Mo, and what rivals are doing with their money. And some people, and we know this, there are factions. As ever, I believe that the truth is somewhere in between. But there are factions rabidly pro and rabidly anti the ownership, and some people who have kind of tried to defend the levels of expenditure compared and contrasted with other teams or domestic rivals, have pointed to the fact that there's been quite a lot of investment in infrastructure, and that perhaps this is the reason for less investment on the playing personnel side of things. It can be cold comfort, Mo, but what do you make of that particular factor?
I simply don't accept that as an argument. I mean, yes, we have invested. We invested 56 million on the AXA training facility, which is a very fine facility for the club, but it was funded from club generated revenue, and we have been repaying the main stand loan. That was a loan that was procured by FSG. It was not their money, I should clarify. They didn't loan their own funds to the club to then bankroll that expansion of the main stand. They borrowed money with interest, and then they lent that interest free to the club. Club have been repaying that. So that was £110 million worth of borrowing, and the club had repaid 39 million of that between 2017-18 and 2020-21. So that's over that 4 financial year period, 39 million of that have been paid. So when you add the two amounts together, it equates to 95 million. And I'm talking about the period for which we have published accounts available. So for the season that has just finished, 21-22, which finished obviously about 4 months ago, the accounts for that won't be published for a few more months yet. So we don't know how much further that main stand loan was repaid, how much further it was reduced. But that 95 million, clearly a substantial sum. However, during the same period, we know that Tottenham Hotspur had spent in excess of £1 billion and had in excess of £800 million of borrowing related to that stand. And yet, despite that, they were still outspending us in the transfer market in the last couple of years. You look at Manchester United, they are a club that are mocked even for their stadium. It's said that it is rusting away and falling apart, and it rain's falling through the roof when it's wet and all this stuff. And yet they still, over the same period that I've just talked about, spent £67 million, which is not a massively dissimilar figure to the 95. And yet Manchester United, when it comes to transfers, have significantly outspent us. I mean, just in the summer 22 transfer window that finished a few weeks ago, their net spend was in the region of about 200 million. Our net spend was in the region of about 5 or 10. So, and that, by the way, when you have to put it into wider context, is where, for the first time, Liverpool may have exceeded the turnover of Manchester United. Manchester United's turnover has already been announced and has been published, and that was 583. I estimated Liverpool's turnover would be 580 million or more. Some reports have put it as high as 602. Again, that's just speculation. But the point being, turnover pretty much on an even keel now between United and Liverpool, and their wage bill almost certainly was higher last season, and their debt had grown significantly due to changes in currency. So, sorry, not currency, but exchange rate. So, despite all of that, we look at some of our rivals. United still spent 67 million on infrastructure. Tottenham Hotspur in excess of £1 billion, and even some of our other rivals around us and clubs even further down the table, such as Leicester City, spent more on infrastructure, and yet, my argument has been that it was not a case of having to spend on infrastructure or transfers. It was a case of, based on the revenues we were bringing in over the last few years, we had the ability to spend on both. So I simply don't buy that as an argument made by some.
So it doesn't need to be an either or, is what you're saying. And what I like always about talking to you is that it's not just two lads shaking their fists at the clouds and saying things must improve, something must be done. You always try to at least offer some solutions. So with that in mind, having said what you've just said, what do you think the club could have done? What could the ownership have done? How could they have approached things differently when it comes to investment? How could they have maybe tweaked it so there was more money spent on incoming footballers and still stick to what we know is a stringent financial model that they like to run?
Yeah, so they could have looked at several approaches which could have helped the club and Jurgen and co with ultimately spending more on transfers. And yes, I mean, transfers are not the be all and end all, but the reason I put that thread out in the first place is my concern, and it's clearly a concern shared by many fans, that we as a club have almost stood still in a way, not completely, clearly, but we've allowed one or two clubs to perhaps close the gap on us, and we've allowed our squad to reach a certain age profile, and our squad is now, I think, first or second oldest in the league, and this is something I felt could have been avoided had we taken a different approach. So some of the approaches that we could have taken to ultimately spend more over the last 4 seasons could have included using some of the money that FSG brought in, which was quite a considerable sum from Redbird. So as you may recall, in 2021, FSG sold a stake of that group to Redbird Capital, and I think the stake was sold for approximately £500 million. Now, there was absolutely nothing whatsoever to stop FSG investing some of that into Liverpool Football Club. And they could have put it into, for example, reducing or paying for some of the capital infrastructure work, which then would have freed up money to spend on transfer fees. So it wouldn't have been necessarily FSG using the Redbird money to bankroll transfers, which they hate to do, and they've never done that. But instead, reducing the commitment on the infrastructure outgoings. They could also have looked at refinancing, the loans that were taken out, or the loan that was taken out for the main stand, and also perhaps delivered the AXA training facility through that same route. So the club, 56 million outlay on the AXA training facility or complex was entirely funded from the money that the club had brought in from TVs, for Champions League, Premier League, from commercial revenue, or from match day. None of that came from loans. None of that came from the owners. And that, again, could have been funded from taking out a loan over a longer period, maybe 10 years, and then instead of paying 56 million off over the space of 2 seasons, instead it could have been spread out over 10 years at £5-6 million a year, which again would have freed up more money to spend on transfers. Now, one of the things that again FSG have never really done, but is actually quite common in football, is to take out some short-term borrowing to fund transfers. So Tottenham Hotspur, who are renowned for being even more stringent than Liverpool Football Club, their owner, Joe Lewis, and their ownership group is called ENIC. They took out borrowing of, I think it was 120 to 150 million this calendar year to help finance transfer spend in the summer transfer window just gone. And that's something that Tottenham Hotspur's ownership group have never done. But they felt that, look, we've got a manager that cry-asses all the time if he feels that the owners are not backing him in transfers. So we think we've got a really good manager. Let's go out and back him and get some fine talent in, and they spent that money, but they took a different approach. And last but not least, again, what is to say that FSG couldn't have invested some of their own money into helping finance some of the activities of the club. Now, again, FSG have always been open and said that that's something that they don't believe in. But that is out of kilter with the vast majority of owners of football clubs in this country across all tiers, even down to semi-professional level. You will have owners of football clubs investing their own money into their clubs, and that goes right up to the Premier League, where the majority again of owners do invest their own money into the club. There are a handful of owners that don't, most of whom happen to be US based. The Glazers most notably. They don't just not invest their own money, they actually take money out through dividends from Manchester United every year. That was £30 million, by the way, for 21-22. That is something we know that FSG don't do. They don't take out dividends from Liverpool Football Club. But I've just outlined there straight away 4 or 5 different things that FSG could have done slightly differently to help finance more deals. And when I talk about more deals, I'm not saying that the club should have bringing in, 4, 5, 6 players every summer. And I said that earlier on, that we got to a point by 18-19 where we didn't really need to do that. We had the base of a really, really top-class squad. But even if we brought in one quality addition each summer on top of what we were doing already, that would have been 4 additional players, and we could have managed 4 out over that same corresponding period. And that is again part of the frustration that I have. I felt that had we operated in a slightly different way, especially in light of COVID, that model could have been flexed somewhat, and I felt there was just really no flexibility shown. And again, that may have been a hindrance rather than help in terms of where we are now.
Can't help but agree that there seems to have been an opportunity or two missed. And as a kind of an interesting point, as almost a segue into the second of your factors for our underperformance, I do want to ask you about one more thing. And again, it's something that I think those who seek to champion FSG will lean into a little bit, and that would be the growth in our wage bill. Now, obviously, the Champions League involvement means there's a significant growth in that. It is acknowledged as the biggest area of expenditure for the club. And like I said, leaned into by those who would go around white knighting for FSG as proof positive of why nothing can be done and why nothing should be said. However, is the growth of that wage bill a very, very, very big factor when it comes to the availability of funds that are then open to Jurgen Klopp for transfer fees. What do you make of that argument that's regularly pushed out there, that the growth of our wage bill is if not the, then a major factor in the absence of fees being available to be paid out for transfers?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an argument there to be made. However, again, this part of the thread that I put out back in late August, I did benchmark something called the wages to turnover ratio. So of the turnover generated by a club, how much of that is spent on the wage bill? And that analysis showed that Liverpool's average over 4 years, so it's not something I did looking at one season in isolation. I looked at it over 4 years. It showed that the average for Liverpool Football Club was pretty much on par with most of the clubs around it. I mean, there is an outlier in Tottenham Hotspur. Their wage bill has always, well, not always, but certainly for the last number of years, and especially since our wage bill skyrocketed from about 208 million back around 2016-17 up to north of 300 million after that. Their wage bill tends to be less than 50% of their overall turnover, and regularly is about 40%, whereas Liverpool's is in the high 50s, hovers just under or around the 60% mark. And a lot of our rival clubs are in and around that percentage as well, give or take 2 or 3%. So again, yes, it has increased, but then so have the wage bills of other clubs around us. Now, granted, Manchester City are a special case, and the way in which they operate financially is different to ours, and arguably that very different to many clubs out there. And Chelsea, it's published in their accounts that in the last 2 or 3 years under Roman Abramovich's ownership, he invested £250 million into that club. Our owners have not invested a penny into Liverpool Football Club. So again, that's not a penny into the club since around 2012. So that again shows the kind of advantage that Chelsea has compared to Liverpool, in that that they had an owner that was able to do something like that, and that is very, very significant. Manchester United historically have generated significant sums, well in excess of ours, but we have largely closed that gap. And then Arsenal are a bit of a strange case in that, for the last 3 or 4 seasons, their turnover has not been to the levels of ours, but they also have not got a wage bill that's on our level either. So their wage bill tends to be a good 100 million or so less than ours. And in fact, that has slightly decreased further still as they've moved on a lot of their more established, older, more expensive players and replaced them with younger, less expensive players. So their wage bill, if anything, has probably come down compared to what it was a couple of years ago, even though clearly their trajectory is very much upwards. So the wage bill argument is a reasonable one, in the sense that clearly the more you spend on wages, the less money is available for transfers. But it's not dissimilar to most of our rivals. And again, when you look at what our rivals have been spending in transfer fees, they largely do dwarf us over the period post 2018. So I think wages are an interesting one, in the sense that we do know Liverpool Football Club have heavily incentivized contracts in place for pretty much the whole squad now. and certainly more heavily incentivized than at some of our rival clubs. And perhaps there's an argument to be made that if they were less incentivized, that might help free up a bit more money to spend on transfers. And there might be some that will argue, well, no, we should, pay more on wages in order to ensure that we are a destination rather than a stepping stone. But if that means that the available funds for transfers are relatively meagre compared to other rivals, then again, it all weighs in on the kind of underlying issue there, which is that ultimately there's not enough recruitment there, and then you're retaining more players and aging them out as a group, and you're saving up a problem for future years, and we're very sharply getting to that point now.
Well, you've done it now, Mo. You've created yet another conspiracy theory in my mind, which is basically that we're underachieving on purpose so that people don't have to pay those incentives in their contract. lads are being deliberately shit because it's all part of some greater scheme. I'm going to lean into that one. It's given me some hope. It's around about now that we sort of find ourselves moving into the other area that you wanted to talk about, which is one of the root causes of why we've all been so sad when we regard our favourite team of late. And this particular one did create a lot of discussion. Apparently some fellow fan media outlets were putting out some content directly refuting your argument, which is that Klopp has been overly loyal to certain players. Now, why is it that you think he is like that? Why is it that this loyalty is a feature that has been so discussed by so many? And how do you feel it's factored into the specifics of what we're here to talk about, which is why the wheels have come off at the start of this season?
Okay. Right. So I'm going to try and be diplomatic with some of the stuff I say here, because I know that I'm in the presence of one of the paid-up members of the Jimmy Milner fan club, but
cut loose, man. Just cut loose. It's all good.
So, right. Look, I certainly think that the model that we put in place, which I felt worked so well in 2016 to 2018, was all about making sure that you're able to bankroll some of your transfer fees by generating a reasonable amount from sales of players, and it's also as well as investing, making sure that some of that is offset by selling players on at the right time. Now, again, through some of the research that I was doing as part of the threads that I was putting out over recent weeks, I was looking at the amount of money that we were bringing in as a club, and what I was seeing was, we were really underperforming when it comes to sales of players. Yes, I mean, we've pulled off one or two blinders over the years. 23 million for Ryan Brewster was, fantastic. Absolute masterclass by Mikey Edwards 3 years ago. But, the big sale that we had over recent years was Felipe Coutinho. And that sale is now coming up to 5 years. So it's nearly 5 years since he left us to join Barca. And, since then, we've really not had all that much by way of big sales. The biggest probably has been that of Sadio Mane, and that's not even £30 million. And yet when you look again at some of our rivals, Manchester City of all clubs, over the last couple of years, brought in some, fantastic fees for players. And, for me, the model works best when we know that a player is just about to hit the kind of closing stretch of their peak, and still has some value in the market. And, we can sell that player for 40 million, 50 million pounds. And clearly we've not been doing that. And I think part of it is the fact that we've been looking to retain players for too long. And I think linked to that, and this is my second root cause, it's the Klopp loyalty factor. I really think it is a thing. There were other media outlets that went out and said, no, we think the guy's talking bollocks. I don't think that is the case. I think, and let me give specific examples. So James Milner, I think he's been a fantastic servant for Liverpool Football Club. But I very much lean towards the Dave Hendrick kind of view about Jimmy. I think that, his time has been and gone. And, we reached that point, in my view, 2 or 3 years ago. Yet he's still here. And clearly, there's arguments to be made that he's been retained for more than just what he can do on a football pitch. And, the kind of squad dynamics in terms of what goes on beyond the 90 minutes on a match day are clearly important. And having a character like that around can be worth its weight in gold. But I still think that, look, that is a position within that 23-man squad that could have been taken up by a younger player, 23, 24, that can give a bit more, on the pitch. And I think that, that's a clear case of a player being retained longer than they should have been. Manchester City were not exactly putting up a huge fight to retain him when he was age 29 back in 2015, when he left them on a free to join Liverpool. And they felt then that, look, we've had Milner's best years, and, we don't really mind that he goes to a rival club. Jordan Henderson, very contentious subject. And, the contract renewal that went through for him last year, which would keep him at the club for 4 years if you were to see that contract through, created a lot of debate last year. From what I'm led to believe, that there was, a split within the club about whether that was the right thing to do. There were arguments, and again, I clearly don't know this for a fact, that Jurgen put up a big fight to get the club to agree to this deal. And it seems that was successful, because clearly he signed this contract extension and he was retained. And again, my view is that, this is a player, albeit the captain of the club, that was certainly at the end of his peak years for Liverpool Football Club. And that's not to say that he should necessarily have been sold there and then, but certainly in my view, a contract extension should have been put in place. And, it might have been that could have prompted a sale this summer, when he, by that point, would have, I think, only had a year left on his contract. And again, that would have not gone down well with some sections of the fan base who absolutely revere the club captain. Now, Sadio Mane, we did sell, but, that was only because the player made clear he wanted a change, he wanted a new challenge summer last year. So that was in the pipeline. From then, had he not expressed that and was happy to stay and earn a paycheck, he would also have been retained. Gini Wijnaldum left for the same reason. He was another player that Klopp would happily have retained. And again, you can point at, one or two others, even Dejan Lovren. Klopp was happy for him to remain. Adam Lallana, Klopp was happy for him to remain. All of these players, had they been so inclined to just stay at Liverpool Football Club because they enjoyed being, in that group, in that dressing room, earning well, can you imagine that? We would have had a squad where, about 12, 13 players would have been age 30 or more by now. And the only reason that Lovren, Mane, Lallana left, Gini Wijnaldum left, is because they fancied a change, not because the manager felt now's the right time, not that the club felt now's the right time to optimise, proceeds from sales and move them on. It was because the players wanted to go instead. And that for me is not good succession planning. It's not the right way to operate as a club, especially given we as a club are more dependent on generating sales than the Manchester City, who generate money in other ways. And, as we're seeing increasingly Chelsea, Todd Boehly is coming in with a consortium. Boehly himself is not somebody that is a mega billionaire, but it appears that some of his partners have immense wealth behind them, hence why they spent, I think it was 300 million in a transfer market, in the transfer window just gone. So this all is very concerning. I think that I have been expressing the concern that, we were going to let the squad reach a certain age and we then leave ourselves with very little time to replace, a large and increasing group of 30-year-old plus players. And the fact that they're 30 years old or more in itself is not an issue. I'm clearly not ageist. I'm well above that age. But the kind of issue I have is that the playing style that we've had under Klopp is so physically demanding. The training regime that we have is so physically demanding. Players are aging out prematurely almost. They're reaching their peak before they hit 30. So by the time they're getting to the point of being 30 or more, we are seeing now that, that there's very few of these players that are still at their peak at the age of 30, 31, 32. And so it makes it, for me, even more important, and there's greater imperative to ensure that there is that healthy churn, that healthy turnover of players. And even though it might be upsetting for fans to see a player that might still look like they've got 2-3 years left leaving, that is the way to operate properly in light of the model that we have in place. And the only way around it is to get money from elsewhere, such as direct owner investment or finding magical ways to generate commercial income from non-existent betting companies. But we don't operate in that way. So if we don't operate in that way, then we have to have a better model of squad rotation by way of players coming in and players going out. And for me, that simply hasn't been in place. And I put a lot of that down to Klopp's loyalty to players that have served him well. And I think he has a real hard time letting players go. And he has this emotional attachment to them. And that is in many, many ways a strength. But I think in other ways it is also a weakness.
It's funny, I wonder, is there a little wrinkle here in this particular part of our discussion too, in terms of the fact that the club has suddenly, over the last few years, become a destination club, as opposed to where we were only 5 years ago, 6 years ago, where, we were the final stepping stone before you went to Barca or Real. And if that has had a kind of a knock-on effect with one or two of the people who might have made potentially lucrative sales. And of course, the other wrinkle is we may be very dependent on player sales for our transfer strategy, but there's also the idea of moving a player on and then the wages that were being paid to that guy become available as available funds theoretically. I know it doesn't necessarily work like that in real life or real time, but these are all sort of little grey areas around it. And all they do, both of those points, all they do is sort of add to what you're saying. And I suppose I wonder then, when you compare and contrast us with what other people are doing, again, because it's kind of how we assess ourselves in general in all areas of life. And do you think that our transfer strategy and therefore the available funds have been adversely impacted then by hanging on to these players as a result of this loyalty than we probably should have? And do you see that elsewhere when you look around at our rivals? Do you see that trend there as well, in terms of failing to move on assets that are not absolutely essential or that are absolutely at their prime for, like you said, maximizing their market value, having given some service to the club? Do you see that pattern amongst our rivals as well?
Are you that person who has everything? The coolest merch and those must-have fan threads? Well, over at our Anfield Index shop, we've gone that extra mile when it comes to pimping up your Liverpool collection. From our popular range of bespoke design t-shirts, sweaters, hoodies and hats, to our signature edition mugs, prints and coasters, all provided with fast worldwide shipping. We have something for every red. We also stock official LFC merchandise and are licensed with the Premier League and UEFA to sell official iron-on shirt badges and sleeve patches. As a listener to this podcast, you can get 10% off everything with coupon code AIPRO10. Just head over to AnfieldIndex.shop or find us on Etsy by searching for Anfield Index.
In some areas, yes, and others, no. Clearly our biggest rival, not historically, but in terms of the current context, has been Manchester City. We've been back and forth, toe to toe, over the last, best part of 4 or 5 years now. Now, they had a squad that was at the top end from an age profile perspective relative to other clubs in the league. But in the last, 4 years or so, they've moved on some very big characters in that dressing room. Vincent Kompany, David Silva, Yaya Toure, Sergio Aguero, one or two others. Raheem Sterling, clearly not a player that's, hitting the age of 30 or more, but a player that the club felt, actually, we probably got our best years out of him, and we can perhaps maximise transfer fees by moving him on now. And that's the sort of thing that I don't think Liverpool Football Club would do. And that was quite a ruthless move in certain respects. But, they felt, look, we think we've got the best out of him, and let's move him on elsewhere. So I think that Manchester City, clearly their financial context is very, very different to ours. And, I've gone into detail on Twitter and on Money Talks in the past about how dubious I think that whole setup is. But what they have been able to do is increasingly generate more sales, sort of proceeds from player sales in the last couple of years, and they actually turned a profit in the transfer window just gone, which their fans have been very happy to gloat about. Now, what they've managed to do is achieve a very good, almost optimal profile in terms of their squad. They've got a very good mix of younger players, Haaland most notably, as well as at the other end of the spectrum with some of the more established players. But they, in my view, and I would argue, they haven't got an excess of players that are kind of at the higher end of the age profile. So their balance seems almost spot on, and it's really good. And they've done a very good job over the last, 3 years or so in achieving that. Albeit, their financial means, as I touched on earlier, are different to ours. Chelsea, their context is very different, but they've brought in a raft of younger players. Also, in the summer transfer window just gone, several older players. So they've got a bit of a disjointed approach, but I think that'll settle down. And it is known that, it's no secret that they are very strongly interested in young Mikey Edwards. And if he were to join Chelsea, later on down the line, that could pose a serious threat to Liverpool Football Club. We also know that they brought in somebody that's been quite key in the recruitment at, I think it's RB Leipzig. So again, they're certainly looking at all the right places in terms of, identifying the top people to bring in the cream of the crop in terms of young talent. And I think that will be their strategy going forward. So, they're also, getting things right. I think the only club I can, really point to and say perhaps they're also guilty of what Liverpool Football Club are guilty of in terms of letting a squad age out together, perhaps would be Tottenham Hotspur. So their age profile as a squad is not too dissimilar to ours. And the thing with them, though, is that their wage bill is significantly below that of ours. And yes, they've got this massive debt relating to the new stadium, But as I touched on earlier, that is something that will be paid off over a prolonged period, and it then allows them more funds to be able to invest in transfers. So, it is something that also, as a club, Tottenham have a manager that is renowned for being quite ruthless. He's not somebody that gets overly attached emotionally to players, and that's the sort of thing that it can be good in certain respects, but also a bit of a drawback in others. But I think other clubs around us are very cognizant of the fact that you cannot, especially the way the football is played nowadays, have a group that's full of 30-year-old plus players. And we're going to end this season with, I think, as things stand, at least 10 players who will be 30 or more. And that's not great, especially when several of those players' contracts are ending this summer. And are we financially going to be able to afford to bring in 5 or 6 players all in one fell swoop? Possibly not, in which case we may end up extending the contract of Jimmy Milner for yet another year into the 23-24 season. And obviously that will trigger off fume to unprecedented levels on social media and elsewhere. But that is entirely possible and plausible on the basis that if you've got a lot of work to do in terms of enhancing the squad, we may not be able to address every gap, and we may end up retaining, even for 1 year, 1 or 2 players that we might have been expecting to go next summer.
Even the theoretical fume is amusing to think about, Mo, on that particular last point. And we're going to narrow our focus as we come to the end of the show on our ownership group, on FSG. And I'll finish with the big controversial question of, where do you stand in terms of the extremes of opinion on them? But let's just ease our way into that by talking a little bit about how you perceive their strategy for running the club. I mean, as we look around us, we've got rivals who are, as you've outlined in this show already, splashing more cash than ever before. How effective can it possibly be, in your opinion? How can it possibly even be an option for us to deliver more success for the club in the current way that we're operating? I mean, is it possible that, I think I know the answer to this before I ask, but is it possible that we could have an FSG bulb going off over their head moment where we see a change in philosophy that might result in them deciding to open up the purse strings and let the cash flow? How realistic is that? Because I do worry that some people are still holding on to that possibility as being out there.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Trev. The landscape financially, as we are in this ostensibly post-COVID era, continues to change. Financial fair play, as was, is being phased out, and it's being replaced by a new version, which is based on several factors, one of which is that no more than 70% of your wages, of your turnover, I should say, should be spent on wages. And Liverpool Football Club are under that. But it's not just wages, it's also what's called amortization, which is the accounting treatment for spend on transfers. And when you factor those two in, wages plus amortization, Liverpool Football Club at the moment would be over 70%. Though if we spend very little on transfers, then we'd fall within that. So that's interesting in terms of how we will achieve that when that is fully implemented. But, that aside, there are now... It is ultimately easier when we move to that model of financial governance for certain types of clubs to be even more cavalier in terms of bringing in revenue from interesting sources to present club revenues that are higher than they would otherwise be. And apologies to listeners if you think I'm talking riddles. I'm trying to be careful from a legal perspective. But yeah, the concern is, look, the changes that are being implemented by UEFA with the old FFP going out, the new model coming in, will make it easier for certain types of clubs around us to spend even more. And we already see that with Manchester City. We're now seeing it with Newcastle United. You know, they spent in the last calendar year more money than we've spent in the last 4 years. And that's Newcastle United. And they're already in European places. You know, their squad is already starting to look good. And another couple of years of investment, and I fear that their squad will look very, very strong. Then we see Chelsea. You know, they have this consortium which seems to have significant amounts of money. Now, it's interesting because their owner, the front man, Bowley, talked very much around running Chelsea in the way that we, or FSG, run Liverpool. But if the evidence of the last transfer window is anything to go by, then he's doing the complete opposite. Yeah. So, you know, all of these things are a concern. And if we rigidly stick to this model of self-sustainability, that the owners put no money into the club whatsoever, then I do fear that sustained success is definitely not possible, and successful stop will become increasingly harder to achieve. Because, you know, if Manchester City, if in the couple of years, Newcastle United, Manchester United, if these clubs, even an Arsenal, you know, in the next year or two, are able to spend in a way that's different to us, then it doesn't bode well. It doesn't. And, you know, is it possible for FSG to change the way that they do business where football is concerned? It is. I think it's highly unlikely, though. Now, that's not to say it's not possible. You know, Arsenal are a club that FSG, you know, John W. Henry in particular, really looked at as the beacon, the kind of model that they wanted to kind of copy and follow when they first came into Liverpool Football Club 12 years ago. And, you know, the Kroenke family, who FSG know well, have changed their model. You know, that they've freed up the purse strings, and that's why Arsenal have been able to outspend Liverpool despite generating significantly less turnover over the last several years. So they changed their model. As I touched upon earlier, the Tottenham Hotspur owner, you know, very, very carefully stringent financial model that has been discarded to an extent as well, and they've gone in a slightly different way. So we're the only club now at the top of the Premier League that's still sticking to a certain way of doing business. You know, the Glazers, we know that they take money out of Manchester United, and yet they are always willing to sanction you know, significant amount of spend, and they are a bit more cavalier, to use that word again, in how they finance deals in the transfer market. So, you know, we're the only club that is operating in a way that was pretty much the way we operated 5, 6, 7 years ago under FSG. All the other clubs have evolved and moved since then, and that is my concern, that, you know, if we stick to that way of doing business, it really could hamper our efforts to maintain the success that we've seen under Klopp over the last 4 years. And yeah, it is something that I think all Liverpool fans should be concerned about if you know, they want us to continue to achieve what we've seen Klopp and co achieve since 2018.
Now we'll finish by asking you to pull the pin on that particular thorny issue about your opinion on the current ownership group. But we are in a world where nothing is set in stone, and only this week, earlier in the week, we saw Brit businessman Jim Ratcliffe talking about how he would like to buy a premium, or was it Premier club, and he had been frustrated in his efforts to try and get Manchester United from the Glazers. Now, you suggested when this news broke that perhaps Liverpool would be a club that he might look at as a potential target, right in that category that he outlined himself. And you noted that FSG have been seemingly open to selling for a while. Now, how likely do you think it is that the ownership group may cease being the focus of so many fans' ire, because they may well look to cash in on the brand that they've grown over the last few years in the near future?
Yeah, it was interesting that he made those comments. We do know that he put in a very late bid in for Chelsea, and that's when that bidding round was occurring back in the spring, which obviously Bowley and his consortium eventually won, and he missed out on Chelsea. It's known that he's a United fan, and he had conversations with the Glazers, and they said, no, we're not looking to sell. And why would they? They know they've got an asset that pays them, 30 million pound a year. And, that asset will probably appreciate in value over the next 5 to 10 years. And, they're not in any rush to clearly sell that club. Meanwhile, Ratcliffe, who is also the owner of one of the French clubs, Nice, is looking to buy a Premier League club. And he specifically used the word, I think it was either premium or Premier. And of the available clubs, we are then left with a short list, I think, of 2, Tottenham Hotspur and Liverpool. Now, our FSG are selling. Their official stance is they're open to selling a minority stake in the club. Privately, it's known that for the right deal, they would sell the club outright. Are they actively looking to sell? No, they're not. If they were, then I think it probably would have come out by now. But when big offers have been made, they have been open to considering them. So on this very podcast, I think it was about 4 years ago now, Adam Crafton, then of the Mail, now of the Athletic, wrote an article in the Mail, a very detailed one, explaining that there was some Middle Eastern group that had expressed an interest in buying Liverpool, and Adam had seen emails and other evidence showing that FSG were seriously considering it, but then it turned out that it didn't really have any kind of substance to it, and so that interest then ended very quickly. But that was something that the evidence that was seen by Adam suggested that FSG, for the right offer, would seriously consider selling outright. And I don't think that has changed. And when I put some tweet out this week, that was followed up by Tony Evans, a well-known writer, saying that, FSG would sell up for the right deal, and that's been the case for years. So I think for them to sell, given that Liverpool Football Club have appreciated in value significantly over the last few years, it would probably be an offer of at least £4 billion, likely £5 billion or more, that would tempt them to sell. They know, though, that if they were to hold on to the club for another 10 years, the value of the club could be, by that point, 8, 9, 10 billion pounds. So, they're not in any rush to sell. But if Ratcliffe or even somebody else is really, really keen on Liverpool, then if the offer's right, then I think FSG would sell. But at this stage, it feels unlikely that they'll sell. But these things can move very quickly. So if an offer comes in, not necessarily from Ratcliffe, but from elsewhere, and they think that's attractive, then I think they'll cash in. bear in mind they bought the club for £300 million. So, even if it was even only he says 3 billion, that's a 10-fold return on investment in the space of 12 years, which is certainly not to be sniffed at, and they would be delighted at that. And what is also known, by the way, Trev, is that they are at the moment trying to secure finance. They're looking to potentially purchase an NBA franchise, and they're also looking to carry out some significant works to Fenway Park in Boston. And one of the means by which they may be able to generate that money is possibly by selling Liverpool Football Club. They have two marquee assets in their portfolio, the Boston Red Sox and Liverpool, and of the two, the one by far that they're more likely to hold on to is Boston Red Sox, given that they've got an attachment to that historic baseball club, and that they are from that part of the world as well. So their ties are very much to the Red Sox, to far greater extent they are to Liverpool Football Club.
Yeah, I'm listening to you there, and I'm thinking about the bigger picture. I'm thinking about quantitative easing, and I'm thinking about the rate at which dollars and currency in general is being printed, and they may turn into fun coupons before we know it, Mo. And the relative value of everything is going to change. An asset, however, remains an asset. So I don't know, unless, like you said, there's a tactical move ahead where they see something of benefit in selling us so they can acquire something else. But acquire they will. I have no doubt about that. Let me finish a very interesting chat by asking you what your gut feeling is then in the end, really. I mean, it's been a bad run of form. The end of last season led to several questions. The period at the beginning of the previous campaign when we didn't have any defenders led to the same kind of questions. We've heard the questions a million times. Some of the portions of our fan base are exclusively directing their ire at FSG and what they deem to be their inadequate performance. Do you have any sympathy with what has become known as the FSG out brigade? Can you see anything that's valid in their arguments? And if so, why?
Oh, goodness. Right. So in a nutshell, I have some sympathy. I think that, and I'll explain why. I think that some of the arguments made by certain sections of the FSG out brigade are completely ludicrous and have no substance, no evidence, nothing to substantiate some of the more far out kind of views and conspiracy theories. There are more measured people within that part of the fan base who will point to underinvestment, and I've talked about that, and I absolutely am of the view that as a club we have underinvested. Now, on the podcast, my last Money Talks with producer Guy, I did talk about the lack of investment or lack of spend rather in the summer 22 window, and I actually suggested it wasn't FSG, it was in fact Klopp, and that is a view that is that has been going around, that FSG made funds available, and when Klopp missed out on Tchouaméni, he wanted only one other player who was unattainable in Jude Bellingham, and was not willing to consider other options, other alternatives. There are one or two others that have contradicted that view and said actually Klopp was open to other players, Nunez, who went to Wolves being one of them, and FSG didn't ultimately sanction the deal. They tried to play hardball, and the player got fed up and went to Wolves. And again, that may have substance, it may not. But ultimately, I, and obviously many Liverpool fans, want this club to maintain success. And it doesn't necessarily mean winning the Premier League season on season. That is not realistic. But I, at the very least, want this club to be challenging most years. And, you know, we're only a few weeks into a season where, you know, yes, things have started off pretty poorly, but there's still more than enough games for it to be turned around. And clearly the chance of winning the Premier League this season is slight, if not highly unlikely. However, there's still plenty to play for. And, you know, we have still a squad with lots of top class talent, and, you know, we could still end it on a high. So I'm certainly not dismissing this season. But, you know, in terms of the owners and whether there is any substance to the FSG shouts that are put out on social media and elsewhere, I think there is absolutely substance to some of what they say. I think overall, though, the ownership have done a lot of good things as well, and we need to be very balanced in our views on them. But do I think that we can move forward under this model that they have in place in a way that will keep us competitive in the years to come? I'm sceptical, being honest, Trev. I think that, you know, the landscape is changing, and if we don't change with it, then my fear is we'll be left behind. And instead of vying for the title like we have for the last 4 years, instead we'll become a club that will be scrapping to scrape fourth place to get into Europe. And, you know, if that's the case, then, you know, realistically, we'll only be vying for domestic competitions. And as you know, Trev, most of our fans, you know, would rather us not even compete and just put out the under-15s for the Carabao and maybe the under-18s for the FA Cup. You know, that's certainly not where I want to see our club. I want us to be competing and challenging consistently year on year, as do, you know, most fans. But given the scale of club that we now are, given our heritage, given all these other things, you know, we should expect us to be challenging. We should be at that top level. And, you know, my view is that the owners need to flex accordingly. And FSG do better is my ultimate shout with all of this. FSG need to adapt, need to change. And if they want to rigidly stick to something that was put in place when they felt FFP would be a thing, would be something that would actually be implemented, and doesn't move with the times, then that is not great. And that is a concern that I think most fans should have. Alongside that, though, and my final point, Trev, is that the shout that is made is, look, if FSG aren't the answer, then who is? What is? And I don't have the, you know, there are, you know, several thousand billionaires out there. I don't know who they all are. I mean, it's more than just states that are billionaires. There's many individuals, families who have immense wealth. And again, I'm not advocating for FSG to sell up to any of them. I've not done research into any of these people, but the arguments that made is, look, we'd rather have FSG for all their faults than, you know, people who've got an appalling track record when it comes to human rights, or, you know, some of these wider political issues. And again, that's almost a podcast in itself. But, you know, I think that, yes, are there faults to be found in the way that FSG operate? Yes. But have we come a long way under them? Absolutely. So it all needs to be balanced and measured in terms of assessing them. And I think just off of a few bad weeks, you know, we shouldn't be calling for them to go necessarily. And certainly there were very few shouts for them to leave the club when we were racking up 92 points at the back end of last season and taking the whole season right until its very final stages in the Champions League, Premier League, and obviously winning 2 domestic cups. So, yeah, my ultimate view on this is I'm happy for them to stay, but I just want them to change.
Look at you being all rational and reasonable and nuanced and logical and multifaceted in how you approach things. Don't you understand, my friend, that we're supposed to be screaming at each other like a pair of toddlers and threatening to do all sorts of violence upon each other when we bring this topic up? That's how this is supposed to run. It's not supposed to be a logical, rational, adult conversation. I am very glad, however, that it was. And it's genuinely always a joy to chat through topics with you and consider the options as you lay them out. That last one really left me thinking, you talk about all the billionaires that are out there and through the recent awfulness as we had that upward transfer of wealth in the world. There's a stat out there that it was every 34, 36 hours a new billionaire was created over that period. So you're right. There are options out there, and it will be interesting to see if any of them come our way in the next while. But Mo, it's been a pleasure as always. I think it's fair enough to say that we covered all the bases. So for another great show, I just want to say thanks very much.
No, thank you. Thanks for joining me. As ever, you've been a magnificent host, and it's been lovely to discuss these topics with you, Trev.
That was Money Talks with Mo Chatra. I've been Trev Downey. We'll talk to you soon.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this Anfield Index show. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel so future podcasts find their way to your device automatically. There's nothing quite like fan engagement, and we'd love to know what you think of anything discussed on this show. The best way to get in touch is over on our free Discord community, where both podcasters and listeners debate the hottest LFC topics 24/7. Sign up free now at AnfieldIndex.com/Discord. You won't regret it. You can also follow us on Twitter at Anfield Index and find us on Facebook by searching for Anfield Index. Oh, and before you go, we'd love it if you could leave us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. It only takes a couple of seconds, and it means the world to the people who create these free shows.